Something interesting happened with the Jurassic Park series between 2001 and 2015. It went on hiatus. There were only 4 years between the releases of Jurassic Park, The Lost World, and Jurassic Park 3, but then we waited 14 years for the next installment in 2015, Jurassic World, which for all intents and purposes was really more of a soft reboot than an actual sequel. And in that 14-year gap, our understanding of the planet and how best to protect it went through a massive shift. And that shift is reflected in the series. The first 3 Jurassic Park films advocate for a strictly isolationist, hands-off approach to conservation.
And if we could only step aside and trust in nature, life will find a way.
But a decade and a half later, the mandate had changed. Now we needed to do everything we could to intervene on nature's behalf.
We will save them. What a gift.
So which is it? Are we supposed to leave nature alone or get in there and save it? And why the switch? How are dinosaurs used in fiction to represent the threat of our own extinction? Was Michael Crichton really a climate change denier? All that and more on today's episode of Saurian Cinema.
These creatures require our absence to survive, not our help.
So you went from capitalist to naturalist in just 4 years. That's something.
This video is sponsored by From.co. Aw yeah, we're back, baby. Stay tuned till the end of the video to find out which film this canvas depicts, and to get a discount code for your very own. Part 1. Jurassic Park and the isolationist argument.
After careful consideration, I've decided not to endorse your park.
So have I.
It's hard to misinterpret the stated theme of Jurassic Park. Leave nature alone.
So the kind of control you're attempting is, it's not possible. Listen, if there's one thing the history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories, and it crashes through barriers painfully, maybe even dangerously, but, well, there it is.
Well, the question is, how can you know anything about an extinct ecosystem? And therefore, how could you ever assume that you can control it?
Dinosaurs and man, 2 species separated by 65 million years of evolution, have just been suddenly thrown back into the mix together. How can we possibly have the slightest idea of what to expect?
The recreation of the dinosaurs is characterized as more than just dangerous. It's downright immoral.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun. Oh, what's so great about discovery? It's a violent, penetrative act that scars what it explores, what you call discovery. I call the rape of the natural world.
The foundational issues with the park, the so-called lack of humility before nature, are only compounded by the greed and self-interest of the people in charge.
We can charge anything we want, $2,000 a day, $10,000 a day, and people will pay it.
You know anybody who can network 8 connection machines and debug 2 million lines of code for what I bid for this job?
We're gonna make a fortune with this place.
When the park inevitably breaks down and the dinosaurs break free, the well-intentioned John Hammond keeps insisting that it's just a temporary startup delay. But then people keep telling him that the very concept of a dinosaur theme park was only ever destined to fail.
When they opened Disneyland in 1956, nothing worked.
Yeah, but John, if the Pirates of the Caribbean breaks down, the pirates don't eat the tourists.
When we have control again.
You've never had control. That's the illusion.
Life, finds a way.
The message couldn't be clearer. Don't mess with Mother Nature.
I want to go now.
One of the more surprising elements of the film, at least for me anyway, is that it doesn't spend too much time telling Hammond what to do instead of building a dinosaur theme park, or even how to fix it. Everyone just keeps telling him that he screwed up.
Mr. Hammond, after careful consideration, I've decided not to endorse your park.
But why, though? Why is building a dinosaur theme park such a bad idea? Isn't he just trying to create an especially ambitious zoo? Well, no, not according to the book. Zoos don't recreate nature, Malcolm said. Let's be clear, zoos take the nature that already exists and modify it very slightly to create holding pens for the animals. Even those minimal modifications often fail. The animals escape with regularity. But a zoo is not a model for this park. This park is attempting something far more ambitious than that, something much more akin to making a space station on Earth. The film briefly tries to parrot this point, that there's a fundamental difference between a zoo and a dinosaur theme park, but I think they fumble it a bit.
Condors. Condors are on the verge of extinction. If I was to create a flock of condors on this island, you wouldn't have anything to say.
No, hold on. This isn't some species that was obliterated by deforestation or the building of a dam. Dinosaurs had their shot, and nature selected them for extinction.
They make it sound like Malcolm is objecting on principle here, like he objects to the principle of bringing extinct animals back to life. But he's not. He's objecting to the danger, the very real material risk that Hammond is taking with other people's lives. See, we can make all sorts of assumptions about dinosaur behavior based on their fossils, which is all well and good and truly fascinating. But if we ever needed to control the dinosaurs based on those assumptions, things could only ever fall apart before we finally learned which theories were right and which were wrong. And by then, a lot of people would have died.
Clever girl.
Death is baked into the idea, and Hammond never wanted to admit that. If anything, you'd need to study dinosaurs in the wild first, before you could ever hope to put them in a park setting safely, although something tells me that observing them in the wild wouldn't go too smoothly either. The hands-off, isolationist messaging continues in the Lost World.
Look, she has to touch it. She can't not touch. She can't not touch. Once she sees, look at that. Once she sees something, she's got it.
4 years after the events of Jurassic Park, John Hammond has transformed himself into a dedicated naturalist, vowing to protect the animals he created at any cost. But when he suddenly loses control of InGen, the new board of directors promptly resurrects plans to remonetize the dinosaurs.
And now it's only a matter of time before this lost world is found and pillaged.
So Hammond sends a small team of researchers to Isla Sorna, where the dinosaurs roam free, in order to document them alive and in their natural habitats, so as to use public opinion to help protect them from outside interference.
Yikes.
But before they've even started documenting the animals, InGen's other team shows up and starts capturing as many dinosaurs in sight in order to transport them back to the mainland. But it turns out their arrival wasn't completely unexpected. Hammond had word that the two expeditions might overlap, and embedded a sleeper agent within the team.
Hammond told me these people might show up. I thought we'd be finished by the time they got started, but in case they weren't, he did send a backup plan.
What backup plan?
Me?
Turns out Nick Van Owen is a militant environmentalist who's there to prevent the capture of the dinosaurs by any means necessary. Now, you could make the case that Nick, Hammond, and also Sarah Harding wind up taking much more active roles in protecting the dinosaurs than anyone did in Jurassic Park. But then they're not the protagonist of this film. The protagonist is Ian Malcolm, and he's an isolationist hardliner.
No, honey, no.
He's such an isolationist that he actually makes for a pretty passive, reactionary protagonist, if you ask me, content to simply react to whatever complication might arise. But it does put him in a position to be the film's most vocal spokesperson for the isolationist approach to conservation.
Taking dinosaurs off this island is the worst idea in the long, sad history of bad ideas.
He doesn't even care about the safety of the dinosaurs. He just wants to get his family off the island.
I'm taking my daughter out of here. Anybody who wants to come with me, this is your last chance to get out.
Even Harding's stated purpose of just observing the dinosaurs gets significant pushback from Malcolm.
We're here to observe and document, not interact.
Which, by the way, is a scientific impossibility. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, whatever you study, also changed.
Granted, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is meant to describe a feature of quantum mechanics, not dinosaur behavioral studies, but I can see the point he was trying to make. With both expeditions soon stranded, they reluctantly team up to make a mad dash for an old radio station in order to call for help, and do their best not to get eaten along the way. Probably not their very best, though. By the end of the film, Malcolm escapes with his family back to San Diego, but they're soon followed by a bull T-Rex, the one dinosaur that InGen managed to capture and transport back to the mainland. But of course, it immediately gets loose in suburban San Diego. Malcolm and Harding then lure it back to the boat with its baby and then ship them back to Isla Sorna, where they'll finally remain undisturbed for the rest of their natural lives. If the last lines of Jurassic Park merely serve to underscore the point that building a dinosaur theme park is a bad idea,
After careful consideration, I've decided not to endorse your park. So have I.
the last lines of the Lost World offer at least a sliver of prescriptive action.
And if we could only step aside and trust in nature, life will find a way.
Hammond says it isn't enough to simply leave nature alone. He says we need to take dedicated, proactive steps to make sure we don't interfere. So if anything, the isolationist messaging is only ramped up in the sequel. You can't control the dinosaurs. You can't even observe them. Their secrets are not for you to know. All you can do is stand aside. The film is so evangelical on this point that as soon as the hunters arrive, the notion of documenting the dinosaurs in their natural habitat is instantly abandoned in favor of simply sabotaging the other expedition.
Personally, I kinda wish they'd circled back to the documentary angle at some point, or at least gotten everyone on board with the sabotage.
Nick Van Owen almost single-handedly manages to strand both groups on the island, and then orchestrates their rescue all by himself, which turns the rest of the characters into pretty passive observers of their own story.
Boy first.
Every second counts. Anyone who thinks I can keep up, welcome to try.
Okay, here it comes.
No. Ian, rest.
But then this video isn't meant to be like a review of each film.
I only bring it up because, mediocre screenplay aside, their choice of protagonist goes a long way to underscore this isolationist hands-off theme.
They picked this theme at the expense of a more exciting script. So clearly it was important to them. Now, Jurassic Park 3. Being the worst film in the series, probably has the least amount of things to say about the—
Just kidding.
JP3 is actually my second favorite film in the whole series. Y'all just don't know quality when you see it.
Alan. Alan.
4 years after the events of the Lost World, paleontologist Alan Grant is duped into a sightseeing aerial tour of Isla Sorna with the promise of lots and lots of money. But when they actually land on the island against Grant's wishes—
Billy, tell me we didn't land.
They're promptly grounded by an especially territorial Spinosaurus. The rest of the film is basically just a collection of increasingly intense set pieces as they make a mad dash for the coast. JP3 is unique in the series for not really trying to deliver much of any mission statement on the dinosaurs, so much as one man's opinion of them.
I read both of your books. I like the first one more. Before you were on the island. You liked dinosaurs back then.
Well, back then they hadn't tried to eat me yet.
Alan Grant is my favorite character in the Jurassic Park series, by the way. He's so grumpy. I love it.
Here we are in the worst place in the world. We're not even being paid.
And he's even more of an isolationist hardliner than Malcolm.
No force on earth or heaven could get me on that island.
Yeah, Malcolm followed his girlfriend to Isla Sorna. Grant had to be kidnapped.
Dr. Grant, will you please sit down?
What's interesting to me is that, as far as Grant is concerned, there's no need to intervene on the dinosaurs' behalf. Not because they don't need our help, but because they're not actually dinosaurs.
Now, what John Hammond and InGen did at Jurassic Park is create genetically engineered theme park monsters, nothing more and nothing less.
This idea is lifted straight from the book, by the way, that the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park aren't really dinosaurs.
When geneticist Henry Wu points out to John Hammond that having to fill in so many gene sequence gaps with frog DNA means they've only approximated the recreation of the dinosaurs. It's interesting to me that both Grant and Hammond want people to leave the dinosaurs alone, but only one of them has any sympathy for the dinosaurs, and it's not the paleontologist. I just find the contrast interesting. I wish like hell they'd shared more screen time than just the first Jurassic Park. Once they're on the island, Grant's main mission is to just stay alive, but he still manages to voice his displeasure at the idea of bringing dinosaurs back to life at several turns.
This is how you make dinosaurs?
No. This is how you play God.
JP3 doesn't spend a lot of time rehashing old arguments about why it's a bad idea to build a dinosaur theme park. In part because nobody's arguing that it's still a good idea.
The one time anyone seems to think cloning dinosaurs is a good idea is when Billy steals some raptor eggs in order to help fund Grant's research. And when Grant finds out, he comes down on him like a bull-eyed meteor.
Some of the worst things imaginable will be done with the best intentions. You know what, Billy? As far as I'm concerned, you're no better than the people that built this place.
But then Billy dies in the next scene. Or appears to die anyway, and Grant soon revisits his earlier criticism. And it's not like he goes so far as to condone the stealing of raptor eggs, but he admits he can at least understand the impulse.
You know what the last thing I said to him was? I said, you're as bad as the people that built this place. Which wasn't true. I have a theory that there are two kinds of boys. There are those that want to be astronomers and those that want to be astronauts. The difference between imagining and seeing, be able to touch them. And that's all that Billy wanted.
Up until this point, Grant had been the series' biggest hardliner when it came to isolating humanity from the dinosaurs. Is this a softening of the original trilogy's isolationist view of conservation? Carving out an excuse for people who just really, really want to see dinosaurs?
I wouldn't go that far.
This isn't an endorsement. It's a eulogy. Billy died for his transgressions. Well, up until the point the writers decided it was too depressing and brought him back to life in the last 5 minutes.
I rescued your hand.
But the ending of the film couldn't be clearer. When not one, but two branches of the military show up to make sure that dinosaurs and man remain separate forever, it's characterized as a joyful victory, the triumphant return of a prelapse Saurian equilibrium in which man and beast will go their separate ways for the rest of time.
So I guess a lot happened over the next 14 years.
Part 2. Jurassic World and the Interventionist argument. Jurassic World picks up 14 years after Jurassic Park 3, and I guess a lot's happened since then, because now, dinosaur theme parks are suddenly fine. So fine, in fact, that they're downright boring. Jurassic World is not only fully operational, it's struggling to maintain sales in a world struck by dinosaur fatigue.
The park needs a new attraction every few years in order to reinvigorate the public's interest, kind of like the space program.
In order to boost profits, operations manager Claire decides to breed a new dinosaur hybrid with all the most lethal genes that geneticist Henry Wu can cram into it.
Bigger than the T-Rex.
He thus creates the Indominus Rex, an apex predator with no social skills that still manages to fool its captors into thinking it escaped, escaping for real when they open up the holding pen to try and figure out what happened, knocking out all the park's security systems one by one, and then finally taking control of the pack of raptors sent to kill it.
That thing's part raptor.
At that point, the only thing left for the heroes to do is to release another apex predator into the mix, and hope it all evens out in the wash.
I guess it's no secret that I don't like this film very much.
I sort of made a whole video about it. I didn't like Jurassic World.
But my purpose here isn't to tear it apart.
So as not to sound too unbalanced, I'll admit that while this film might have one of the more bonkers premises of the whole series,
these guys are gonna run straight into the enemy's teeth and eat them, belt buckle and all.
At least it commits to that bonkers premise 100%. Like, the internal logic might be insane.
We're on the same side, right? Right?
But at least it's consistently insane.
Now, analyzing the Jurassic World trilogy is going to be a lot messier than analyzing the Jurassic Park trilogy, because the second trilogy just isn't as thematically consistent. You could definitely build a decent counter-argument to everything I'm about to say. I'm not denying that. But let's take a look anyway.
So right off the bat, we have a working dinosaur theme park at the start of the film, which is just a huge change from the original trilogy. The thing we were told was impossible from First Fruits is now chugging along with nary a care in the Jurassic World. What happened? How'd they crack the code? Is it possible they finally learned enough about the animal's behavior in the wild to safely put them in a park setting?
Well, maybe. But I think something else happened too.
There's a very telling line from InGen CEO Simon Masrani right after the Indominus Rex breaks free.
The very existence of this park is predicated on our ability to handle incidents like this. It was an eventuality, okay?
This is extremely telling. Perhaps the only difference between Jurassic Park and Jurassic World is that management now considers escapes to be inevitable. They're simply factored into the cost of doing business.
I like this a lot. The idea that capitalism doesn't prevent catastrophes, it just incorporates them into its business model. Someone finally decided to take another crack at building a dinosaur theme park, not because they figured out how to prevent dinosaur escapes, but because they decided escapes were an acceptable risk.
When a dinosaur finally does escape, the thing to do isn't panic, or even to shut the park down.
Everyone, remain calm.
But to simply enact the protocols required to bring it back under control.
Let asset containment capture it quietly.
Granted, all the attempts fail, spectacularly I might add. But then the Indominus Rex is presented as a special case. She's a bastardization of nature that InGen never really had complete control of in the first place.
It didn't eat him. It's killing for sport.
This is how the film expresses its new take on conservation, that nature is something to control.
In order to regain the equilibrium seen at the beginning of the film, the park managers don't need to leave nature alone. They need to wrangle it, harness it, get it back under their thumb. Any concession to nature's autonomy is treated as an escalation of the original problem. Every new gene inserted into the Indominus somehow gives it yet another security skirting special ability. The Dimorphodons quickly rack up the biggest body count of the film as soon as they escape, and when park management finally lets the raptors loose in order to hunt Indominus down, they promptly switch sides. It's only in the very last scene that any characters willingly give up their control over nature and live to tell the tale, when Owen takes the harness off of Blue and Claire releases the T-Rex from its pen. And what do you know, they promptly do the humans' bidding anyway. The Indominus is finally defeated through the combined efforts of Blue, the T-Rex, and one very territorial mosasaur.
Now I could see someone trying to argue that this is in fact a return to the original trilogy's theme, that we need to leave nature alone in order to restore the balance.
But let's be real, the only reason Blue and Rexy get to survive at the end of the film is because they're still obeying the humans. Notice how the T-Rex doesn't suddenly turn on the heroes once Indominus is dead? She just wanders off. So does Blue. This is a form of control. The remaining humans are free to rebuild, or not rebuild, as they see fit. But make no mistake, the humans are still in charge here. Owen Grady is the only character in the film with a stated disinterest in controlling the dinosaurs.
You're in charge out here, you gotta make a lot of tough decisions. It's probably easier to pretend these animals are just numbers on a spreadsheet. But they're not. They're alive.
But then, of course, he does, in fact, have more control over the dinosaurs than anyone else in the film. A few of the raptors briefly turn against him, but just a few scenes later, they're back on his side.
This is one of my main problems with the Jurassic World trilogy. How often we're told one thing, but shown another.
Even though the film tells us multiple times that nobody is really in control of the park.
Call it off right
now.
You
are not in control here.
I don't control the raptors, it's a relationship.
The key to a happy life is to accept you are never actually in control.
We're still shown a story about our heroes regaining control of nature. And even if you still want to insist that Jurassic World is ultimately a story about leaving nature alone, I won't argue, but the sequel does promptly undo that.
Holy!
In Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, the interventionist argument is made even more explicit. When a long-dormant, previously unmentioned volcano on Isla Nublar suddenly goes active, debate rages back on the mainland as to whether the dinosaurs should be left to die or forcibly relocated to a new island sanctuary. In a rare moment of dramatic tension within the sequel trilogy, the old school seems content to let the dinosaurs die.
I think that we should allow our magnificent, glorious dinosaurs to be taken out by the volcano.
Whereas Claire is dead set on saving them.
Okay, so your kids. An entire generation has grown up in a world where dinosaurs are living and breathing. But soon they're gonna have to watch them go extinct. Or not.
Interestingly enough, Claire can't get enough support to save the dinosaurs through charitable means, or government intervention.
After thorough deliberations, the committee has resolved not to recommend any legislative action regarding the de-extinct creatures on Isla Nublar.
So she eventually resorts to private equity, accompanying a team of InGen-backed mercenaries to the island, ostensibly to rescue the animals, but really just to wrangle as many as possible and then auction them off back on the mainland.
It was a lie. Bastard! It was all a lie!
Fallen Kingdom makes several pointed references to the original trilogy. Like, annoyingly pointed, if you ask me.
Like, I'm sorry if a reference this forced and unearned made you cry. Congratulations on the recent mastery of your times tables, I guess.
What surprised me, though, is how the film makes explicit callbacks to the theme of the original trilogy without actually using it.
John said it best. These creatures don't need our protection. They need our absence.
Yeah, great callback, guys. Except this isn't a film about leaving nature alone, because these creatures do need our protection. If we're talking about saving them from an active volcano...
We need to get on that boat!
Like, I get the point you're trying to make, but these animals very much do require saving. So despite one regurgitated line from the original trilogy about leaving the dinosaurs alone, this is still very much a story about a group of heroes who are constantly taking very active steps in order to save as many dinosaurs as possible. And I'm not saying that as a strike against the film.
One of the more interesting things about the sequel trilogy to me is how much more proactive the heroes are than the heroes of the first trilogy.
Remember how I said everyone's basically just trying to get off the island in one piece throughout the first trilogy? Well, the goals of the heroes in the sequel trilogy are a lot more proactive and complex than mere survival. And I actually think that's one of the cooler things about them. People have goals that aren't just stay alive. They're trying to regain control of the park, maintain a positive relationship with their favorite raptor, rescue the dinosaurs from an active volcano, rescue the dinosaurs from late-stage capitalism, and the third film sees them jet-setting around the world in order to expose a plot to destroy the world's food supply.
This is one of the main reasons why I think the sequel trilogy is pushing intervention as a theme.
Because the heroes keep very busy trying to keep the dinosaurs alive. Not just from the machinations of capitalism, but from natural disasters too. In one of the few instances of a character making a decision that might actually cost them something, Maisie ends the film by releasing all the dinosaurs into the wild rather than letting them die. Another instance of taking very proactive steps in order to ensure the dinosaurs' survival.
This is, for what it's worth, my favorite film of the sequel trilogy, so I hope it doesn't sound like I'm knocking it too hard for switching themes on us. I don't believe any film is good or bad based solely on its choice of theme.
I have plenty of other problems with this film, but pushing for a more proactive approach to conservation as a theme is not one of them.
And so, we finally come to Dominion.
In order to instigate revolutionary change, we must transform human consciousness.
Jurassic World Dominion isn't just my least favorite film in the Jurassic Park series. It's probably one of my least favorite dinosaur films ever made. Suffice it to say that this film has a huge problem coming up with clever solutions to any of its problems, much like its two predecessors, but this one doesn't have the wonderful texturing of Fallen Kingdom or the consistency of Jurassic World. It's all over the place. Set pieces play out like video game cutscenes. All the speeches sound like they were procedurally generated by ChatGPT.
Why do we dig? Because paleontology is science, and science is about the truth. And there is truth in these rocks, and there is truth in these rocks.
And the dinosaurs themselves have never felt more like an afterthought.
Those idiots making hybrids had it all wrong. You can't engineer loyalty, you have to nurture it.
And yet you are, in fact, using the exact same targeting system as the Indoraptor. Why aren't you shooting them? Oh, Deacon Lockman. Someday I will cast you in a good dinosaur film. At least this film makes the interventionist approach to conservation clearer than ever, with the heroes intervening all over the place in order to ensure the safety of the dinosaurs.
I am gonna get her back. I promise you that.
Dominion opens with all the dinosaurs living amongst the humans as if it's a normal thing now, with mosasaurs preying on catches of fish, ceratopsians roaming the prairie, and Quetzalcoatlus roosting in the World Trade Center. Sure. Claire is now a militant environmentalist who springs captive dinosaurs from illegal breeding facilities with the help of Fallen Kingdom holdovers O'Huragan and What's-His-Face.
Nope.
Franklin. His name is Franklin. Franklin's fed up with the life of a radical environmentalist and soon announces that he's leaving.
We're done. I got a call last week. It's a real job, something I could do to effectively change things.
Oh, interesting. The film makes a distinction between militant environmentalism and jobs that can do real change. So where's he headed?
Why, to the Dangerous Species Division of the CIA, of course. I wish I were making this up. So the plot, if you want to call it that, is that Blue's asexually reproduced daughter and Maisie are both kidnapped by rival genetics company Biosyn. And so Claire and Owen have to infiltrate a dinosaur smuggling ring in order to track them down. Meanwhile, Ellie Sattler and Alan Grant gain access to a secret Biosyn base in order to prove that they've been releasing genetically modified locusts into the wild, which feed on any crops that Biosyn didn't produce. This leads them all to the same far-flung dinosaur research facility, which promptly suffers a security shutdown, and leads to several climactic encounters with the local wildlife.
Giganotosaurus. Biggest carnivore the world has ever seen.
Man, Alan Grant is not on his game here. The blue whale is the biggest carnivore the world has ever seen, which is worth clarifying, if only to point out how cool it is that we get to live at the same time as this.
Yeah, I know I talk a lot about like my love of dinosaurs on this channel, but really, they're only a nose or two ahead of whales.
So what does this film have to say about conservation? Well, it keeps running with the theme of the previous two films, and advocates for a much more proactive approach to conservation.
It isn't enough to do nothing.
But this film takes it one step further than any previous film in the series and makes a single, teeny tiny goofball attempt at telling us what we should actually do.
At the beginning of the film, it's suggested that dinosaurs and humans are already sort of coexisting, and that the real problem is the way that certain parties keep trying to exploit genetic engineering. So the thing to do is to put a stop to those parties. Nature is doing just fine, but we need to prevent people from exploiting nature if we're going to maintain equilibrium.
And for what it's worth, I think this is an interesting, meaty, worthwhile theme.
I do not hate the subplot about locusts eating all the non-Biosyn crops, because it mirrors Monsanto's real-world attempts to weaponize copyright laws in order to corner the market on seed. I think Biosyn CEO Louis Dogson is an interesting villain. He's not like a murderer or anything. He's just a capitalist.
What's the matter? Don't look so worried. There's opportunity in everything. Even this, you'll learn that.
Remember how I said earlier that capitalism doesn't prevent catastrophe so much as it just incorporates it into its business model?
That's on full display here.
When we're afraid, what do we do? What have we done before?
We follow through.
Where I think the film comes up short is in the notion that if the heroes simply reveal Biosyn's plot, that'll make it all better.
It won't. Or at least, it shouldn't. It didn't in the real world.
Half of Congress probably owns Biosyn stock. Nevertheless, after Biosyn shuts down and all the dinosaurs are saved, the movie makes a Hail Mary attempt at diagnosing the ultimate problem, and comes up laughably short.
Complete systemic corruption in the executive ranks.
Systemic corruption. Got that? Write that down.
Ah yes, the neoliberal anthem. The problem is corruption of the system, not the system itself. The problem isn't capitalism, it's one bad CEO. Every speech in this film is somewhere between bad and awful.
You're racing toward the extinction of our species, and you don't care. You know exactly what you're doing, but you won't stop. You can't.
But the film's final prescriptive thoughts are by far the worst.
If we're going to survive, we'll have to trust each other. Depend on each other. Coexist.
Christ, they really couldn't do better than a meme bumper sticker, could they?
Okay, but regardless of whatever weak-ass political conclusions they may draw, or the contrived scripts,
or the criminal misuse of one Deacon Lockman, the Jurassic World trilogy remains fairly consistent in its messaging that nature requires a very hands-on, proactive approach to conservation, as opposed to the Jurassic Park trilogy, which advocates for a strictly isolationist, hands-off approach. An interesting contrast, if I say so myself.
And thus, having concluded my 2 close readings of either trilogy, this is where a term paper or a C-tier video essay would probably end.
But this change in themes represents a fascinating shift in everything from public opinion to real-world climate policies to our scientific understanding of the planet, creative control of the franchise, and how dinosaurs are used in fiction to draw parallels to our own existential struggles. And I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about any of that.
In fact, I think that examining just one particular question stands a good chance of answering, or at least addressing, all the others. So, was Michael Crichton really a climate change denier?
Part 3. Yes with an if, no with a but. Jurassic Park was written by Michael Crichton and published in November 1990. Crichton also wrote the first draft of the Jurassic Park screenplay and the sequel novel The Lost World. I think it's safe to say that he had more influence on the themes of the first trilogy than anyone else involved, and he had some very pointed things to say about humanity's relationship to nature. There's a prominent subplot in the novel where the heroes have to prevent a ship with escaped juvenile raptors on it from docking in mainland Costa Rica. A subplot that I think the filmmakers did well to cut because even the novel admits that dinosaurs running loose on the mainland were never going to pose much of a threat. These animals, lacking predators, might get out and destroy the planet. That's Hammond talking there. "You egomaniacal idiot," Malcolm roared in fury. "Do you have any idea what you're talking about? You think you can destroy the planet? My, what intoxicating power you must have." Malcolm sank back on the bed. "You can't destroy this planet. You can't even come close." "So what are you saying? We shouldn't care about the environment?" "No, of course not." "Then what?" Malcolm coughed and stared into the distance. "Let's be clear. The planet is not in jeopardy. We are in jeopardy. We haven't got the power to destroy the planet or to save it, but we might have the power to save ourselves."
Over the years, lots of people have tried to summarize Crichton's beliefs about climate change, including Crichton himself.
In the epilogue of his 2004 novel State of Fear, which is about a group of militant environmentalists seeking to stage 4 natural disasters around the world in order to increase public awareness of anthropogenic climate change, one of which is a tsunami, which has nothing to do with the climate.
The novel features at least one, if not several, authorial insert characters who patiently explain, chapter by chapter, to the uninformed protagonists that climate research is a big hot mess, that nobody knows what's really happening with the climate, and that anyone who wants to try and reduce humanity's carbon emissions through legislative action is a pompous buffoon.
Anyone who doesn't change their mind by the end of the book is killed off in some of the most hilariously brutal methods of Crichton's career.
Eating people alive? Where does that get from?
I guess he knew a lot of people would assume that he's a climate change denier based on that plot summary alone, so he sought to explain his beliefs in the epilogue, with mixed results.
What people are saying is really not true, even though at the end of that book I thought, people aren't going to understand this, so I'll write it in simple declarative sentences, and still people misstate it.
Anyway, here's the shortest summary you'll ever see.
I absolutely believe that warming is occurring, humans are involved, and where it's going to continue for the next 100 years.
Then what did you say that got everybody so upset at you?
I'm not a catastrophist.
So basically, Crichton believed that climate change was definitely real and definitely caused by human activity, but that the problem was vastly overstated, to the point where the people concerned about climate change were set to do more damage to the environment than climate change itself.
I don't think this is as important a problem as other people do. That's the essence of it.
That's the bottom line.
Crichton seemed surprised when people subsequently characterized him as a climate change denier, but for me, it's very simple.
He was a climate change proponent, technically, who nevertheless advocated for all the same things that climate change deniers do.
$558 trillion globally to make this change. I think it's a good change to make. I think we will make it naturally. I think there's a lot of reasons to make it. I'm in favor of making it. The question is whether we should do it as a crash program.
See, when he says whether or not we do it as a crash program, what he really means is whether or not we do it at all.
I find it a little bit difficult to have a conversation, and I mean, I don't mean to have a conversation with you, I find it easy to have a conversation with you, but to talk, when you dismiss the UN people and all that they're getting.
Man, I know Charlie Rose gets a lot of flack for being an awful person, but we really shouldn't lose sight of the fact that he was also an awful interviewer.
What do you like about Patrick Bateman?
What do I like?
Yeah.
I like nothing.
In preparation for this video, I read False Alarm: How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet by Bjorn Lomborg, because he's one of the authors that Crichton cited frequently in support of his beliefs.
I'm taking the Bjorn Lomborg position.
Bjorn Lomborg isn't a climate scientist. He's the head of a think tank that purports to find the best real-world solutions to climate change. Much like Crichton, he believes climate change is definitely real.
There is global warming. Yes, it's man-made. Yes, it is an important problem out.
But that the threat is way overblown, to the point where concerns about climate change are set to do more damage to the planet than actual climate change, largely by ignoring other issues that are much more pressing for the world's most vulnerable.
Most people on this planet actually suffers from many, many other things apart from climate.
Now, this video isn't meant to be like a point-by-point takedown of Lomborg.
He's the kind of guy whose ideas are challenged on his own wiki page, so it's not like anyone needs me to swoop in with some sort of hit piece.
And more important than that, conservatives have been shifting the goalposts on climate change for so long that it's become one of my core beliefs that any attempt to debate them is pretty much a complete waste of time.
In just the past 25 years, they've gone from climate change isn't real, to climate change is real but it isn't man-made, to climate change is man-made but it isn't bad, to climate change is bad but it'll fix itself, to the current iteration, climate change is bad, but it'll be fixed by the free market.
All the while, scientists have dutifully gathered more and more data indicating that every single one of those conclusions is wrong. But it makes no difference to these people. They did not come up with their opinion by looking at the facts, so showing them more facts isn't going to change their mind. I think it's well worth understanding their position, but not in actually debating it.
Just sell Ben Shapiro some beachfront property and move on.
But with all that said, there are some key assumptions that Lomborg makes that I want to highlight, if only because I think they're critical to understanding Crichton's position.
First and foremost, the yardstick by which Lomborg measures everything is gross domestic product. That's his whole thing. He believes GDP is the best current measurement of overall human happiness.
He acknowledges it isn't perfect, but he still says it's the best we've got.
When we talk about human welfare, what we mean can run the gamut, from the level of starvation and deaths in society, to access to education and economic opportunities, to the level of happiness and general life satisfaction. GDP does not perfectly encapsulate every one of these aspects of human welfare, but it turns out to be the single measure that more strongly than anything else relates to most of these impacts. Okay, that's already a pretty bold claim, but then he goes one step further. Even the threat of climate change itself is evaluated purely as to how much it's going to cost the GDP, not in lives lost, or extinct species, or collapsed ecosystems, but in how much it's going to cost the economy.
Which is already a pretty callous way to evaluate potential threats, but what's more, he's just plain wrong. GDP is not our best measurement of overall human happiness.
We literally have studies on overall human happiness. In fact, I would personally go so far as to say that every single one of those other factors he listed would, in fact, be a better indicator of humanity's overall well-being than GDP. And yet Lomborg proceeds unabated. Higher GDP per person not only means less death, less poverty and starvation, but also better opportunities, better access to infrastructure, and higher well-being and life satisfaction. That makes it a good yardstick for human welfare.
And while GDP is generally correlated to a lot of benchmarks for human progress, access to medical care, general standard of living, life expectancy, infant mortality, correlation doesn't prove
America has the highest GDP of any nation in the world at the time of this recording. We're ranked first overall and 5th or 6th per capita, depending on who's doing the calculating. But our life expectancy is only ranked 48th, right above Estonia.
GDP is just the total value of all the goods and services produced in a given place over a certain amount of time.
When your local village idiot buys a Cybertruck, that counts towards the GDP, but it doesn't make it any easier for you to buy a car.
The clearest indication I can think of in recent years that GDP isn't the best yardstick for human happiness is recent years.
America's GDP has skyrocketed since 2020, and yet what hasn't gotten worse over the last 4 years? All that a high GDP means is that the rich are doing better than ever. So while GDP certainly isn't the absolute worst way to measure human happiness, since there are some clear correlations, treating it synonymously with human happiness is a big red flag. because now the way that he arrives at all his recommendations for the climate is by calculating how much it's going to cost the GDP. In essence, he's not actually proposing any climate policies. All his suggestions are economic policies.
So remember, by the end of the century, we're likely, according to the UN, to be, say, 450% as rich per person as we are today. Because of global warming and because of the problems, there'll be more problems than benefits. We will feel like we're only 434% as rich.
He often talks a good game about how bettering the economy is the surest way to better the lives of the poor.
Wouldn't you actually want to save real kids right now instead of helping them incredibly ineffectively in 100 years?
But what he doesn't say so often is that if a policy saves human lives at the expense of GDP, he will advocate against it. As you can probably imagine, it takes a lot of carbon emissions to reduce GDP, because capitalism is generally very good at monetizing emergencies. So the end result is that Lomborg rarely recommends doing anything about climate change up until the point where it starts to affect world trade. When we cut to the chase, Lomborg's willing to tolerate an increase of 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. That's about 3.5 degrees Celsius. Not because that's a good idea for the planet, but because it's cheaper than trying to restrict the warming any more than that, according to just one researcher. In Nobel laureate William Nordhaus's economic model, this optimal point is to be found if we keep temperature rises to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100. At 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit, the climate change damage costs would be 87 trillion, and the climate change policy costs would be 21 trillion, leading to an overall cost of 108 trillion. This is the smallest possible combined price tag the world can achieve. This is Lomborg's sweet spot, so to speak. He says that trying to prevent any more warming than 3.5 degrees Celsius will cost us more in GDP than what we'd gain in GDP by trying to prevent less warming. A think tank's take, if ever there was one. A 3.5 degree temperature rise would make the planet hotter than at any point in all of human history. In the words of Mark Linus, author of Our Final Warning, 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency, you have to wind the geologic clock back about 3 million years to an epoch called the Pliocene to encounter a world where global temperatures average 2 to 3 Celsius higher than at the start of the 20th century. In a 3.5 degree world, the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free throughout the summer months. The Amazon rainforest would transform into an arid savanna. Much of the tropics would suffer seasonal heat waves that regularly exceed the point at which the body can cool itself naturally. The entire West Antarctic ice sheet could collapse. Oceans could rise as much as 2 meters. Vast swaths of permafrost would melt, triggering a positive feedback loop that would make future temperature rises inevitable without advanced carbon capture technology. Which is to say that if we ever reach the 3.5 degree world, the temperature would keep rising, even if we cut all carbon emissions to zero. But at least BP stock value wouldn't dip. Hell, it might go up now that the Northwest Passage is open. But Lomborg isn't concerned with any of those effects, because he says almost every climate change predictive model doesn't take human adaptation into account. The idea that climate change won't be nearly as bad as scientists say, because humans will simply adapt to a changing environment. At its simplest, adaptation means that people react sensibly to challenges. In our case, to a changing climate. Heat waves, crop failures, flooding. He says we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. People will adapt. They'll plant different crops, buy ACs, move to different countries. Yeah, because Europe and America are so accommodating to migrants. It's hard to overstate just how mind-bogglingly obtuse, borderline insulting that this line of thinking is. On the one hand, sure, humans are generally pretty good at taking active steps to ensure their own survival when all the chips are down. Dozens of US cities already have seawalls, levees, dams, and pumps working round the clock to keep them from being flooded. And if sea levels continue to rise, presumably all these systems will simply be upgraded rather than letting the cities flood. But on the other hand, why shouldn't we prefer a world where more pumps aren't necessary? Not to mention, the situation is much more dire in poor countries. Lomborg repeatedly claims to be advocating specifically for the poor throughout his book, but let's take a closer look. One example of human adaptation that he cites is the fact that flood-related deaths have been decreasing in Bangladesh over the past few decades. Which is true. Annual flooding used to claim thousands of lives in Bangladesh as recently as the 1990s, but then, according to Lomborg, they installed flood sirens. Now whenever it floods, everyone just runs to higher ground. Yay, human adaptation! The evil is defeated! Nobody has to worry about climate change anymore. Except, all those people's houses sure do still get destroyed whenever it floods. And which way do you want to guess the GDP goes when they're all forced to rebuild? Also, like, a lot of people do still die whenever Bangladesh floods. Like, it's great that the death rate is going down instead of up, but Lomborg isn't using that fact to try and justify more action, he's using it to try and justify less. Ultimately, Lomborg isn't championing climate adaptation over climate mitigation because it's the best option for the people of planet Earth. It's because it's the best thing for the economy of planet Earth. He might talk a good game about wanting to help the poor, but let's not mince words here. His aim is only ever to increase GDP. If that happens to help the poor, great. But if he had to sacrifice the poor in order to increase GDP, he wouldn't hesitate. Also, I don't know where exactly this is supposed to go in the video, but there's something to be said about who tends to recommend Lomborg's ideas. The National Review, Jordan Peterson, Fox News. He even did a video for PragerU, and they don't make videos unless they want to push a conservative agenda that the evidence doesn't support. It's literally safer to just assume this data is being manipulated or misrepresented than it is to accept at face value. Maybe it's because he's Scandinavian, but he seems to think that spending less money on climate change means spending more money on things like public education and food insecurity.
If you ask most people in the world, what do they care about? Well, I mean, not surprisingly, they would like their kids to stop dying from easily curable infectious diseases, get food, get education. You know, it's simple stuff.
But just look at his audience. Fox News does not want to see that money spent on the poor.
So you could tell the person who's saying, I'm for the Accord, you're killing children.
Seeing who supports Lomborg actually made me rethink some of my own positions on issues that I had initially agreed with him on. Like, I used to be a big fan of nuclear power, but when I saw how hard Lomborg went to bat for it, I decided I should probably look into it a bit more. What makes it so frustrating to debate people like Lomborg and Crichton is that, in a vacuum, a lot of what they say is technically true, and I find myself agreeing with certain parts of their arguments. I think humans are in much bigger trouble than the planet as a whole, although we're definitely poised to take down a whole hell of a lot of other species with us. I think intelligent land management will likely do more good in the short term than pretty much any current plan to reduce carbon emissions. I also think a lot of the reporting on climate change is unnecessarily alarmist.
If Greenland broke up and melted, or if half of Greenland and half of West Antarctica broke up and melted, this is what would happen to the sea level in Florida.
The Greenland ice sheet isn't set to melt for several thousand years, even with no changes to current climate policies. There are more pressing concerns right now. I think both Crichton and Lomborg are very good at pointing out the numerous flaws with our current climate policies. The existing proposals are very costly, and don't do a whole lot in the long run. Even if the entire Western world reduced its carbon output to zero, it still wouldn't offset the projected rise in carbon emissions over the next century as the rest of the world continues to industrialize. And most neoliberal climate policies do not take this into account. If your plan to combat climate change doesn't allow for the full industrialization of the developing world, then all you're really suggesting is continued Western supremacy with a different coat of paint. Lomborg and I agree that the best possible strategy for the mass adoption of clean energy worldwide is to make it cheaper than fossil fuels. Like, that would fix everything. Because once clean energy becomes cheaper than fossil fuels, you don't have to convince anyone to switch. They'll do it on their own. We're thus both in favor of massive research spending in this area. Like, I'd prefer we take the check we write the Pentagon each year and just turn it over for clean energy research. But clean energy is currently nowhere near as cheap and efficient as fossil fuels, and we're gonna have to science the shit out of things if that plan is gonna succeed by the time it'll actually make a difference. Where Crichton, Lomborg, and I disagree is what to do before we reach that point. Lomborg doesn't want to sacrifice anything for the sake of GDP, whereas I'm more than happy to cut into the profits of the ruling class. Crichton and Lomborg don't want to use legislation to restrict anyone's carbon output beyond anything more drastic than a modest carbon tax, whereas I think legislation is one of the most effective tools we currently have. Ultimately, this isn't a question of who's right, so much as what are our priorities? Lomborg's is simple. He's literally the guy from the meme, "Oh shit, the economy," whereas Crichton was at least a bit more complicated. For one thing, he was more interested in efficacy than Lomborg. I mean on behalf of human beings rather than the stock market. And where Lomborg tends to mock climate activists for having such a pessimistic outlook on the future, the young girl holding the sign, "I'll die of climate change," will not, in fact, die of climate change. She is very likely to live a longer, more prosperous life than her parents or her grandparents, and be less affected by pollution or poverty. Crichton seems to have at least understood why this subject provokes such an emotional response in people.
When you have people adopting essentially philosophical positions, emotional positions, which the environment tremendously invites, how I feel as I walk through the woods and how I feel as I see clear cutting or something like that.
You know what I realized on the very last day I was writing this script? I think the reason I wanted to interrogate Crichton's views on climate change so much isn't because he's the author of Jurassic Park, but because he's the only person I know with a conservative view of climate change who might, just might, have been arguing in good faith.
I started to work on something else and I felt like a coward. And I thought, what are you going to do? You have looked at the data and you really believe that it's an effect, but not something that we as human beings should be worrying about lots and lots of other things. I mean, in a sense, I'm taking the Bjorn Lomborg position.
Like, he wasn't trying to get rich. He just took a look at the data and came up with a very different interpretation than the very scientists who gathered it.
But his interpretation was very strict. Very narrow. I don't think he saw the forest through the trees.
As recently as 2005, just 3 years before his death, Crichton was telling classrooms full of kids that secondhand smoke doesn't cause cancer.
I don't want people to smoke. Smoking is bad because smoking causes cancer. But secondhand smoke does not cause cancer.
Because none of the studies could get the p-value down to 5. Basically, the surety hadn't hit 95% yet.
According to the EPA guidelines, you have to have what are called 95% confidence intervals. There has to be statistically strong evidence. They couldn't get it. They did 6 studies. They combined all the studies. They still couldn't get it. They dropped their thing to 90%. To go from 95% to 90%, it's hard unless you know statistics. 90% means it may or may not be there, okay? You want 95% and 99%. They didn't have it.
This is problematic for a lot of reasons, not least of all because it's basically impossible to conduct a randomized control trial on the effects of secondhand smoke, because that would mean deliberately exposing people to known carcinogens. And it's almost impossible to get a confidence interval of 95% outside of a randomized control trial. I talked to one of my friends with an actual background in statistics about this, and he said that the 95% confidence interval standard is basically a holdover from the pre-computer days. We don't need it anymore.
The Surgeon General issued a report way back in 1986 about the links between secondhand smoke and cancer, and it said that, yeah, the p-value hadn't hit 5 yet, but these are still known carcinogens. They're a confirmed risk factor. There's a definite association.
It'd be more accurate to say that we know secondhand smoke causes cancer, but we can't say for sure just how much of a factor it is, not without stricter controls.
But Crichton disagreed, quite vehemently, going so far as to mock his own daughter for trying to safeguard herself from secondhand smoke.
Part of how I got to it was my daughter and her friends were going down the street, you know, pulling their shirts up as they passed some poor schlump out, you know, smoking a cigarette. And I said, what are you doing? And they said, oh, you know, it's cancer. It's not.
And he brought this same myopic focus to climate change, often getting stuck on weird particulars that don't inform the whole picture.
He said we couldn't refer to it as global warming because it wasn't literally happening everywhere on Earth.
Just like 80% of it. He also said that all computer models were worthless because the total range of the furthest outliers were too far apart, and that every climate model should be evaluated for at least 10 years, preferably 20, before any action is taken based on its calculations.
No, but I'm saying if your model is good for 100 years, let's see it run for 10.
Well, in the past 20 years, we've seen the average yearly temperature record broken 17 times. All 10 of the hottest years on record have occurred in the last 10 years.
How many times must the point be made?
By the way, my friend with the background in statistics, he did find one study about the effects of secondhand smoke that actually hit the 95% confidence interval that Crichton was looking for, and it was published in 1997.
He also found a 2004 report from the World Health Organization which took a look at dozens of previous studies on secondhand smoke and found that their confidence interval aggregate was over 95%. And for the record, you're not really meant to glean all that from a single screen cap since these papers are fairly dense, but I'll put links in the description if you want to read any of them, which is more than I can say for Crichton.
Something to remember here, Crichton wasn't a climate scientist. He was a celebrity novelist. I'm not a climate scientist either, but I'm not presenting a theory that opposes what the climate scientists say. Crichton had this tendency to cite certain researchers in order to bolster his position on climate change, only for those same researchers to come forward and say that he was misinterpreting their data. In the epilogue to State of Fear, he literally says, "We cannot predict the future. Not one bit. Full stop."
We can't assess the future, nor can we predict it. These are euphemisms. We can only guess. An informed guess is just a guess.
It's almost like he didn't want to know the future, which is kind of weird given the genre that made him famous.
How do you know, because I believe the future's unknowable, how do you know what this is going to be?
Maybe that's why the first Jurassic Park trilogy is so much more pessimistic than the second. It was built upon the rock of Crichton's inherent distrust of chaotic systems, the idea that complex, dynamic, nonlinear interactions can't be predicted. He was fond of saying that no one can predict the weather more than a week out, so why should anyone be able to predict the climate 100 years into the future?
What do you think about telling me what the global temperature of the climate, predict the climate, no one can predict the weather for a month, the climate 100 years from now, and they go, oh, that's science, that's important, pay $500 million for that, $1 billion. I mean, it's bizarre to me.
Well, because weather and climate are two different things. You may not know if it'll rain 3 months from today, but you can probably guess whether it'll be hotter or colder.
I'm not the first dinosaur movie YouTuber to make that distinction, and I'm sure Crichton knew the difference, which is why his views on this subject are kind of baffling to me.
Then again, his whole shtick was making impossible scenarios sound scientifically plausible, so maybe his climate skepticism was right in keeping with that.
You know, a lot of my books have been about sort of science gone wrong, and I'm always surprised that anybody takes it seriously. When Jurassic Park came out, there was a congressman who was going to introduce legislation banning any research leading to the creation of a dinosaur. I held my breath, hoping to see this happen, but apparently somebody whispered in the guy's ear that it was just a movie. You know, the book that I wrote about nanotechnology is a sort of Frankenstein story, and it discusses technology that is A, impossible at the moment, and B, impossible next year, and C, impossible probably 10 or 20 years from now. I don't really think there's a reason for anybody to be distressed. Enjoy the book.
Crichton passed away in 2008. Computer modeling and climate research have both come a long way since then. It's possible that had he lived to the present day, he might have changed his mind in the wake of new evidence. Maybe. Maybe not. The only thing I know for sure is that it doesn't matter.
We don't have to guess whether it's going to get destructively hotter sometime in the far future, because it's getting destructively hotter right now. Part 4. Hey, is this still a video about dinosaurs?
I can't make a video that's just about movies anymore. I've just straight up lost that ability. Now I write YouTube videos the same way I write screenplays. I need a topic that interests me, and a question that keeps me up at night. In this case, the topic is the Jurassic Park series. And the question is, how do we convince the people who already know the facts about climate change to actually do something about climate change?
Dinosaurs are often brought up in our media within the context of extinction, with whole ecosystems regularly hanging in the balance. You could do a whole video about it.
And that's all well and good. It's a great trope.
But one of the things I like so much about the Jurassic Park films, all 6 of them, not just the first 3, is that dinosaurs aren't treated like a metaphor for extinction. We literally bring them back to life.
We've brought back numerous species in their purest form, and I mean complete, untouched genomes.
It's not a series about saving dinosaurs from extinction, so much as it is about how to live in harmony with this aspect of nature that we have a very hard time controlling, much like the climate.
We're gonna have to cut the tour short, I'm afraid.
What I find especially interesting is how the same incentive to bring dinosaurs back to life, the profit motive, winds up threatening our own species by the end of the series. That's cool. That's an interesting theme to explore.
So what at long last accounts for the 2 takes on conservation? Well, I think very simply that both trilogies are just a product of their times. Speaking very generally, I'd say that the first 3 films of the series reflect our understanding of nature from the 1990s.
That we need to stop making things worse and learn to balance our own interests with that of nature. Try to minimize our impact as much as possible.
The next 3 films in the series reflect our understanding of nature from the 2010s.
That we need to take proactive steps in order to undo the damage we've already done, but that we are also a part of nature, just as much as the dinosaurs, which demands a much more complex understanding of the planet than we ever assumed.
I had to. They're alive. Like me.
Granted, there's also a heaping dose of 21st century neoliberalism, which assumes that all the problems of the world are caused by individual bad actors instead of governing systems. Geez, that could be a whole video all on its own, couldn't it? But I'm not here to argue whether this particular trilogy is any good. I'm just telling you what it says about conservation.
What will the next films in the Jurassic Park series say? Something bold, I hope. Something we haven't heard before.
Dinosaurs still carry immense storytelling power, and I think filmmakers should swing for the fences. If it were up to me, one thing I'd like to explore is the idea that dinosaurs don't just represent big lizards, but super dense packages of data, which surpassed oil as the most valuable commodity on Earth in 2017. Or at least, that's when The Economist started writing cover stories about it. Nowadays, if somebody wanted to steal some dinosaurs and couldn't gain access to InGen's cryo storage, they could just hack a few gigabytes worth of gene sequences and call it a day.
I'm not saying that should be the plot, mind you. I'm just saying this is a different way to think about the dinosaurs. And even if you want to stick with tradition and use the dinosaurs as a metaphor for our relationship to nature, did you know that the amount of warming that the Earth is projected to face over the coming century has dropped significantly in just the last few years?
Back in 2017, we were facing a projected rise of 3.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. In 2023, just 7 years later, the projected rise had dropped to 2.7. It drops all the way down to 2.1 if current government pledges are honored. Granted, the drop has plateaued in recent years, and any neoliberal administration can renege at any time. But the point still stands.
We can do this. We have the capability. Maybe even the inclination.
It probably won't involve anything as dramatic as inventing cold fusion or dismantling capitalism, although regular viewers know that I'm a big fan of both. In fact, I think dismantling capitalism will be required if we're going to save anyone from climate change who can't afford to buy a mobile fleet of flying homes.
But until that day, we can still make steady, meaningful advances in clean energy production and progressively aggressive regulation.
Ban cars. Turn former blacktop into new green spaces. Regulate what these companies are and aren't allowed to do to the environment. Don't just let them purchase a carbon offset and call it a day.
My hope is that one day, far in the future, climate change deniers will be thought of as the new Y2K deniers. They'll look back and go, you see, people were worried for nothing. Everything turned out fine, because it did.
But only through the concerted worldwide effort of all the people they mocked.
Now, nearly everybody's forgotten about Y2K, so let me remind you of what was predicted 6 years ago. A meltdown of civilization as we know it. Can't get any stronger than that. But what actually happened? Essentially nothing.
Part 5. One last thing. I once had the pleasure of watching Jurassic Park in a room full of paleontology undergrads. We spent the whole screening lovingly shit-talking it. Fossils do not come up out of the ground like that. They are rocks encased in rock. You don't just scoop them out of the dirt with your hand.
We all loved it though, and at the end of the screening, I asked one of the other undergrads if she thought it was a good idea to bring dinosaurs back to life. And to my surprise, she said no.
She said that since absolutely every feature of the Earth, from the climate to the output of the sun to the very air we breathe, is all vastly different now from what it was 66 million years ago, that bringing dinosaurs back to life would only ever lead to their inevitable suffering.
Personally, I don't know if I'd have the strength to say no. If scientists ever found a way, and it were somehow up to me to make the call, I'd probably say yes. I'm not saying I'd be right, I'm just saying that's what I think I'd say. Maybe it is a bad idea. But if that's the case, how would we put a stop to it?
Market forces? I don't think so. Market forces are what cause these problems in the first place. How many times must the point be made? Indeed, capitalism doesn't prevent crises, it monetizes them.
Here's a prototype. This prototype is worth $28 million right now. Relax.
Capitalism isn't going to save us. It's going to charge us. I see no reason why government regulation should be sidelined for the sake of corporate profit.
And on that note, one last thing.
Throughout Lomborg's book, he criticizes most every effort that various governments have made to try and curb the effects of climate change through regulation.
He says the current policies don't work, and that all the more ambitious proposals would put too many restrictions on the free market. And it's important to leave that alone, because ultimately, it's the free market that he says will ultimately fix climate change.
And as proof, he offers the historical example of whaling.
The Western world was reliant on slaughtering whales for quality lighting, yet we never did hunt whales to extinction. Why? We found alternative technologies. Exhortations to stop using whale oil, to turn down the lights, or go back to old, heavily polluting practices were not what saved the whales. New technology did.
Great story. Completely wrong.
The peak year for whaling wasn't somewhere back in the 1700s or the late 1850s. It was 1964. 1964. You know what finally did bring commercial whaling to an end? The crash right here in 1986? Anyone care to guess? Anybody?
We banned it.
This video is sponsored by From.co.
Do I remember the old copy? Can I still do it?
From creates beautiful canvas art centerpieces that depict the chromatic chronologies of your favorite films, where each color strip represents the average color of any given frame within a specific film. I love looking at Froms because a lot of them are exactly what you'd expect, like say Avatar, but others are completely unexpected, like Terminator 2. I don't know, I wasn't expecting so many pastels.
Can you guess which one this is? You've already seen the From for Jurassic Park. This is Jurassic Park 3. For a little while I thought I would get each From of the Jurassic Park series in the order in which they came out, but then I decided I was just gonna get them in the order of how much I like them.
They're printed at near 8K resolution, which winds up being so detailed you can often identify individual shots. This red right here is the lecture hall scene, and this wide strip of dark blue is the Pteranodon attack. Yeah, I always thought it happened closer to the halfway point, but it's actually much later in the film than that. And as for this pink here, I went so far as to scrub through the actual video file to check and see what this was, and I'm 99% sure it's Barney. From has an extensive catalog of over 1,000 movies to choose from. They also have dozens of music videos, individual episodes of TV, and now phone cases. They offer multiple customization options for each canvas, including size, frame, and print quality. I opt for the Buffs canvas option because it's printed on a higher quality glossier canvas, it pops off the wall a bit more, and they print the name of the film along the side.
So if you're in the market for an expertly stylized canvas art centerpiece that says as much about a given film as it does your own taste in movies, head on over to From.co where you can get 10% off your order with the discount code ColdCrashPictures.
That's From.co, discount code ColdCrashPictures.
And thus, having concluded my 2 close readings of either trilogy, this is probably where a term paper or a C-tier video essay would end. But this is a D-tier video essay.